Good evening, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming this evening. My name's Steve Campbell. I'm the Campaign Director of the Antarctic Ocean Alliance. I'll be your MC tonight. We're here this evening to launch our shiny new report, the Antarctic Ocean Legacy, a Vision for Circumpolar Protection. And we're very excited to be launching this report. It's been a lot of work, and we're also very excited to be launching it in the UK. It's our first event in the United Kingdom, and it's great to be here. We have three distinguished speakers tonight, plus one Australian, and we will all talk to you from our relative perspectives about the importance of Antarctic marine protection. At the end of the speaking, I'll take you through some of the key elements of the work that the Alliance is doing, and we will also conclude with a short Q&A if anybody has any questions of clarification, etc. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, the Right Honourable John Gummer, Lord Deben, the Chairman of Sandcroft International, and of course the former UK Secretary of State for the Environment. Lord Deben will say some opening remarks, and he does have another engagement this evening that he'll have to slip off to, but we're quite delighted that you're here tonight, sir, and thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here because one's often asked to address audiences on environmental matters. There seems to be a vast number of issues which should concern us, but I can't think of one more important or more timely than the issue which the Antarctic Ocean Alliance is placing before you today. I think one of the most difficult things to get people to understand is the interconnection of everything, and particularly the interconnection of the seas. It's much easier in our lives to stand aside and say to ourselves, well, we'll look after this little bit, we can manage that. I really don't want to understand anything beyond it. At the risk of being rather party political, it's a kind of UKIP view of the rest of the world. We wish it weren't there, so let's pretend it isn't there and that we can operate without it being there. And that's exactly what so many people do when it comes to the environment. In the past, for example, we were very keen on small nature reserves, little bits chopped out, protected from the rest of the world, but of course entirely unsustainable on their own. So what has happened is that we've begun to be much more understanding about the need for much larger areas which are able to deal with the whole of ecosystems that can actually manage the habitat in a real sense. So look at the difference between the small reserves that we would have had 50 years ago and the Great Fen Project, where you're trying to return a whole area of Britain back to the conditions which once obtained and which are so essential for their continuance. Nowhere is that more important than when we come to the seas. And again, it always was a very small picture people had of the seas. They thought of the sea immediately beside them. They talked about their fishing rights. It took a very long time, I'm not sure we even won it, to make people understand that fishermen and the fish are movable all the time. The sea which the fish inhabit is itself hugely important as far as their health is concerned. I just thought it was worthwhile reminding you of a fascinating thing that's happening. Because the seas are warming, the anchovies that used to be caught off the Bay of Biscay have found it too hot there. And they've been moving up northwards, and they're coming into the North Sea. I just think what that means. It says something very important about global warming, but it also says something very important about our other pathetic political measures, because who are following the anchovies but the Portuguese and the Spanish and the French fishermen who have a right to fish them, but they're not where they had the right before. How does the common fisheries policy handle that issue? the issue will not be that it should become less common. It just has to be a better policy. It's a really difficult thing because nature is changing because human beings are changing it. And so this particular politico, economic, geographical and biological change that is taking place right next door to us reminds us of just how interconnected the seas are. And what we're saying this evening is that we won't be able to solve any of those problems unless we face the reality of the vital problems that we do have in the Southern Ocean, in the Antarctic Ocean. And the vision that is being presented to you tonight may be being presented in so distinguished a room, in such a distinguished place in London. It may be being presented thousands of miles away from where the heart of the issue is found, but it affects all of us. It's absolutely central to our future lives as to how we deal with the oceans as a whole. And I'm very pleased that this should be launched here in Britain because we have a long tradition of being willing to go out and research, to search, to discover places very far away, and the Southern Ocean and the Antarctic are very, very special to us in our almost tribal history. You can't talk to a Brit for very long without hearing their feelings of Scott of the Antarctic. Very peculiar when you consider the feelings in Norway of Amundsen and the Antarctic, but very true, very much part of our culture and our history. And perhaps that should serve as a reminder of just how important this is. The waters around in the Antarctic region make up for about 10% of the world's seas, and it's home to 10,000 unique different species. It's a place of huge worth on its own, and it is the last wilderness in a real sense. I don't want, though, for us to concentrate on its uniqueness or its wildness today. What I want to suggest to you is that we should concentrate on its importance, on the fact that it is part and parcel of the rest of the lives that we lead, that this is not something that we can ignore, not something that's happening a long way over there, but something which is crucial for us to defend for our own good. Now, sometimes high-minded moralists object it when you suggest that this is a matter of self-protection. Somehow or other, we ought to have a high-minded view. We ought to say how wonderful it is and how important it is for some entirely altruistic reason. Well, I think we should. But my experience of life, in a very long life, my experience of life is that people very often act more effectively if you remind them that it is in their interest to act, in their interest to change, in their interest to defend and protect. And that's what I hope we're going to do today, because the document here is devastating indictment of what would happen if we didn't take the measures of which we speak. And it isn't just to say that we would be removing a unique opportunity for our children which we have inherited. Although for me that's the central part of stewardship. We pass on to the next generation something better than we've taken from the last. Yes, crucially important moral concept. But what this really shows to us is that we will be the losers, and the loss which we will carry will be a much greater one than most people could even imagine. We need to win this battle. It's not one that we can afford to lose. Not just for the figures, not just for the 10,000 unique species, not just for the 10% of the world's waters, but for us here in the United Kingdom, for Europe, and for the whole of the world. So for me, this is a very exciting occasion. I'm going to have to miss the serious speeches, which will talk in detail about the value that we're seeking to protect. But that doesn't mean that I'm any less enthusiastic about what we are doing. I'm a trustee of the Blue Marine Foundation, which is seeking to create marine areas of marine protection all around the world. We need to protect some 30% of the world's seas if we're going to reverse the decline which we now have in our seas. And we're only up to 1.8%, and 1% of that the Blue Marine Foundation delivered last year. We've gone from 8.8 to 1.8 in 1 year. So there is an enormous amount that we can do, a huge amount that we can do if only we believe that it can be done. This is a vast endeavour, but not one which is out with our reach. So I hope this evening will be a great success. I thank you all for coming, and I hope you will continue to seek to get others to understand why it's important. Yes, lift their hearts. Yes, make them realise this is a moral duty. It's about stewardship. It's about what we owe to future generations, what we owe to the past. It's about all those things. But make them understand too it's about them. It's about the world in which they live, not just the other end of the world, but here. It's about the seas upon which we depend for our lives. It's about something more important than almost anything else they'll be asked, to make sure that the next generation doesn't suffer from the fact that we have failed to see. And I want to end with this because it is for me the most frightening part of all. One of the things that I find fascinating is that the bit of the Bible I least believed in becomes the most true. You remember how when you first read the book of Genesis, you were told it was a myth, and by that word myth, you meant it was something you didn't take any notice of. But the thing that is true about it, which is so fantastically interesting, I think, is the whole question of the way it deals with ignorance and knowledge. When you know, you can't ignore. The point about knowledge was that it was no longer possible to be innocent. It was no longer possible to be, in the proper sense, irresponsible. And the problem for our generation is that we know more than we've ever known. And the more that we know, the more that our responsibility becomes absolute and very, very pressing. For me, this is the real question that we're facing here. Now we know we can't ignore. Now we know what will happen if we do not act. Then we can no longer say, it's nothing to do with me. That's why, if you notice, when American presidents wish not to deal with climate change, they pretend it isn't happening. They say it isn't certain. They demand more proof. They look for someone else because they don't want to know. They know well enough that if they do know, then they have to act. And that's exactly where I think we find ourselves today. We know. And this document means that anyone who didn't know does know now. And when you know, and you've come here and you know, you can't avoid the responsibility which knowledge brings. It is perhaps the oldest myth of all, but it's nonetheless the greatest truth for that. When you know, you have to act. You have to act because you become responsible, and that is what knowledge does. Our job is to spread that knowledge and thereby share that responsibility with those that can make it possible for us to save the Antarctic Ocean and make it possible for us to have the protection which we so need and which is utterly necessary as much as for ourselves as it is for that area so far away.
I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the physics and chemistry of the Southern Ocean and Antarctica. On the maps in front of you, you will see the sea ice duration around Antarctica. And you can see to the west of the Antarctic Peninsula, I don't have a pen, but you can see it pointing up towards South America. To the west of that, you can see that the sea ice is reducing at quite a dramatic rate. On the other side, it is doing the reverse, it is increasing. And overall, we're possibly seeing a slight increase in sea ice over the whole of the Southern Ocean. That has big implications for all the organisms living in the Southern Oceans and around Antarctica. The Southern Oceans, the world as a whole, is warming at an especially rapid rate. It has been suggested in the last few years that it may well be rounding off a little bit if you look at the graphs. Our part of the world is warming even more rapidly, and that is because we have a lot more land in the northern hemisphere. But if you look at the oceans are now taking up heat right down into the deepest depths, down to 4,000 plus meters. And this is something we've only really found out in the last few years. And it has particular implications for Antarctica. The whole of the oceans play an absolutely crucial role in our climate. They have taken up more than 90% of the heat that we have generated since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. They also have taken up a huge proportion of the carbon dioxide, the major greenhouse gas that we've been pumping up into our atmosphere. And as part of what is known as the global conveyor belt, which passes this heat around the world, the Southern Ocean, at its southern limits, is taking down this heat to the very deep waters of the ocean. And if you look at the map in front of you, you can see how it is warm, in particular around Antarctica, in the South Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean. It is penetrating slowly up towards the Arctic, towards the North Atlantic, and into the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific Ocean, slowly through time. And this has happened over the last few decades, just to show you the speed of change that has taken place. And we now know that if you add together the total heat content of the oceans right down to 2,000 plus meters, that is going up continuously. It hasn't rounded off as it is at the moment. And if that heat got back into the atmosphere, it would lead to an even more rapid rise in the temperatures of the world than we're seeing at the moment, with huge consequences for human society. This is a projection of where we might be in 100 years' time from a mathematical model. There's a line drawn across the middle, which is the equator, the southern hemisphere down towards Antarctica on the south, the northern hemisphere right at the top. And we're at about 52 degrees here, roughly. Well, certainly where I come from in Plymouth, it's about 52 degrees. And you can see that we're going to be experiencing temperatures which are going to be potentially up to 5 degrees warmer than they are here at this present time. We're going to experience temperatures in the UK that are going to be comparable to the south of France within 100 years, to the south of Spain in 100 years' time. You won't be going to the south of Spain for your holidays. And if you can see at the bottom, Antarctica is going to be warming up even more rapidly, and the Arctic even more rapidly than other places in the world. This is real. This is going to happen. I'm absolutely certain of it. I've been talking about climate change for more than 20 years, and everything I predicted 20 years ago has happened already. And so I'm pretty certain that it's going to happen in the future. The Southern Ocean is also crucial because it has a lot of organisms living in it that have calcareous body parts. And the oceans, because of the carbon that they're taking in, is becoming more acidic. It's becoming more vinegary, if you like. And this is likely to have a key impact on many of these organisms. We're already at levels of pH in the ocean that are comparable with 25 million years ago. In 100 years' time, they're going to be even greater. This will have all sorts of feedbacks that we have no idea about at the moment. The Southern Ocean, as I said, was warming. It's warming at temperatures which are much faster than anywhere else in the world around the Antarctic Peninsula, as you can see from here. Their temperatures were more than 5 degrees in the winter than warmer than they had been previously. One of the major impacts on that, of course, is on the sea ice, which I had in my first slide, particularly around Western Antarctica. But we also now know that the ice shelves, which are holding up this mass of ice that is sitting on top of Antarctica, they are acting like a dam and holding it up. The warm water from the oceans is penetrating under this ice, and we know that 40% of the ice shelves in Antarctica are now melting from underneath. This is going to lead to big impacts on the ecosystems, another reason why we need to protect them, but it will also have big impacts on humanity. And one of the main reasons for that is because of the weight of the ice, which you can see in the schematic in front of you. Because of the weight of the ice, it is depressing the land underneath it. So as the water is penetrating under these ice shelves and slowly starting to melt the ice, not slowly, as I'll point out in a second, then it's going to start flowing downhill, and there is a danger that these ice shelves and the total ice on top of them become unstable, leading to even more rapid sea level than we're seeing at the moment. One oceanographer that I know has told me that it is comparable to a dragon blowing flames at the bottom of the ice, because the contrast in the temperature below the ice to what is on top is so great. It will also affect us more in the northern hemisphere, what is happening to Antarctica, than in the south, because the huge mass of ice in Antarctica, just like the moon, has a gravity effect. And that means that as the ice sheets in Antarctica melt and affect us, then the effect on sea level will be even greater in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. The opposite to what would happen in Greenland. And this shows you, for example, what could happen with a 1 metre sea level rise to Belgium without additional coastal protection. The fens, which we heard about before, will vanish in the UK. They'll disappear. And sea level rise could be even greater if you look at what might have happened in the geological past. Because in the Pliocene, we had temperatures which were 2+ degrees warmer than they are now, and then temperatures were sea levels were up to 25 metres. There is a lag effect between the warming and the effect on sea level rise. But it is possible that we could see sea level rises that are much greater than 1 metre. The IPCC in its last report predicted about 0.2 to 0.6 metres. They didn't take into account these changes in the ice that are happening in the world and the melting of glaciers. With those, we could see potentially sea level rises of up to 2 metres. This will have a drastic impact on coastal cities like London, and many of the poorer countries in the world, like Bangladesh, will be very seriously implicated. We're doing virtually nothing about this. The major causes of global warming, which are greenhouse gases, and especially carbon dioxide and methane, we're not reducing them. They're going up even faster than before. They're going up as fast as the maximum projections of the International Panel on Climate Change in 2007. In addition, we are pumping out black carbon into the world. Black carbon is soot, basically, but there are organic forms of it as well. When that settles on top of ice, in glaciers, and in the Arctic Ocean on the sea ice, and in Antarctica, it absorbs the heat of the sun, and that leads to the ice melting even faster than it would do previously. And we also know that a major other greenhouse gas, ozone, is contributing to global warming as well, and particularly in the northern hemisphere. So my final points to make to you are that the changes in the world are absolutely crucial to humanity that are happening in the Southern Ocean, a real reason why we should be protecting them. We're not tackling it, the problems of global warming and climate change, with the urgency that we should. They're absolutely pressing, and they're not just important for the stewardship of the world and for the next generation, but for future generations, many generations down into the future, because we've already set in movement something that's already happened. The Southern Ocean is warming extremely rapidly. The warming is moving to the south. The oceans are becoming far more acidic than they were in the past. 40% of the ice shelves are melting around Antarctica, having a huge impact on everything. The potential effects on sea level rise are enormous. We're not doing enough about the problem. It's really urgent. Thank you very much.
Really what I'm going to talk to you about are some of the reasons for establishing a network of protected areas in the Antarctic. And I thought about how to begin this short talk, and I felt that one area that we really had to talk about was exploitation in the Antarctic. This started surprisingly more than 200 years ago with the advent of sealing in Antarctica, fairly shortly after many parts of the Antarctic were discovered. This species, fur seal, was almost hunted to extinction around many parts of Antarctica. You might be relieved to know that there are now about 4 to 5 million of them on South Georgia, so they have really bounced back, and I'll come to the reasons for that in a bit. Following sealing, we had whaling, and this started off actually on shore around sub-Antarctic islands, but then with advances in technology, whalers were able to escape regulation which existed around the land, which was exerted by the governments who managed and owned those particular territories, and started whaling out in the high seas around the Antarctic. They killed something like 1.4 million whales, and basically these whales were turned into margarine, consumption in Europe. And not surprisingly, in the late 1970s, whaling collapsed. Whale populations simply could not sustain the levels of exploitation. Essentially, these whaling fleets moved through from the biggest whales, blue whales, and fin whales, through progressively smaller species. And as you'll see from this diagram on the right-hand side here, it was mainly from Antarctic waters that whaling was taking place. Following whaling, fishing really took off in the Antarctic, particularly with the move into Antarctic waters of the Soviet fishing fleet. So you'll see here really a whole series of depletion of stocks around the Antarctic, beginning around South Georgia in the late 1960s, early 1970s. 400,000 tonnes of this guy, Notothenia rossii, actually taken. That fleet then moved on to the Indian Ocean. Then it moved back into the Scotia Sea after depleting the fisheries in the Indian Ocean. So we see here almost a classic example of fishing down the food chain or food web, where we move from large animals such as whales and large predators such as seals down the food web to smaller fish species, until today we're actually fishing animals like this. This is toothfish. This is the Patagonian toothfish and Antarctic toothfish. And this is quite a long-lived species. They're quite vulnerable to overfishing, and they're managed very carefully in the Antarctic by CCAMLR, the Convention for Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. But there are problems associated with these fisheries, and these seem to focus around the potential effects on predators of toothfish of some of these fisheries, and also on other effects such as the environmental impacts of the fishing practices which are used to take these fish in Antarctica, which is mainly by long-lining. We moved even further down the food web in the 1970s with a move to fish krill. These are the tiny shrimp-like animals on which most of the rest of Antarctic marine ecosystems really depend. It's a keystone species. And these were fished mainly again by Soviet vessels, and krill fishing really collapsed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That fishery was mainly focused in the Atlantic sector of the Southern Ocean. So you see here, this is a measure of sort of catches of krill between 1974 and 2000 in this region. And you can see that the catches were mainly around the peninsula and also South Georgia. As I said, krill is a very important species in the Antarctic. It's the single step from primary production, basically generated by microscopic marine plants in the surface waters of the Antarctic, to higher predators such as whales, seals, birds, fish, and so on. So it's a tremendously important species in the Antarctic. The animal has some interesting peculiarities of biology. It's particularly dependent on sea ice for its growth and development. Basically, the female krill, as they're stocking up to reproduce, feed underneath sea ice, they actually lay their eggs, which end up in deep water. As the krill develop, they actually move into shallower water and feed underneath the sea ice. And of course, sea ice is being affected by climate change. I'll come back to that in a minute. One of the things I did want to point out at this point is that it's remarkable. There are still some quite interesting aspects of krill biology that we know very little about. There's just one example here that I'm showing. In 2008, it was discovered that krill feed on the seabed in extreme deep water, 3,000 metres or so. And this was never suspected until we actually took a camera on a remotely operated vehicle down to these depths around the Antarctic Peninsula. And it really shows that even for an extremely important species like this, our knowledge base is quite limited. Now, there has been evidence that the densities of krill in certain parts of the Antarctic, particularly the Atlantic sector, have been declining. And there is evidence that other species are on the increase concurrently with this decline in krill. This evidence has been somewhat controversial, but it does seem that there are significant changes taking place in some parts of the Antarctic ecosystem, particularly around the Antarctic Peninsula, which is subject to quite marked temperature increases. Along with those temperature increases, there's an increase in melt of glaciers on the Antarctic Peninsula, and that fresh water flowing into the seas around the peninsula are causing quite significant changes in pelagic ecosystems, one of which looks like a decline in krill and a replacement of krill by salps, which are these small gelatinous animals in certain areas locally. The reason that that's not very good is that not much eats salps. So in other words, they're not a replacement for krill as a keystone species in the Antarctic. Just at the point where we're seeing some of these major changes taking place in areas like the Antarctic Peninsula, we're seeing a sudden ramping up of krill fishing. And this is really being driven by two things: the demand for more protein from the oceans, but also changes in technology. Essentially now we've developed technologies which enable us to pump krill straight out of trawls without having to take the trawls onto the decks of fishing vessels. You can just pump the krill straight out of the ocean, essentially, onto the ship for processing within a very short time. Before those animals have actually had a chance to degrade, they're basically turned into a product for export to markets around the world. And those markets include obviously the aquaculture market for fish feed, but also new markets being developed such as nutraceuticals and so on. And as you can see from here, from 2004 to 2010, we've seen quite a marked increase in the catches of krill around the Antarctic. In the last 5 years, we've seen a doubling of the number of krill fishing vessels around the Antarctic, and there are more vessels with this type of krill pumping technology being built as we speak. One of the unfortunate things we are seeing in the Antarctic is basically a decline in many of the important predators around the Antarctic ecosystem. I've just thrown up some examples here: macaroni penguins, black-browed albatrosses, wandering albatrosses, and white-chinned petrels. The reasons for these species going into decline are mixed. Some of it seems to be connected with declines in krill. Some of it seems to be connected with competition with other predators, such as fur seals. One thing we know for certain is that many of these birds are actually being caught as bycatch on longline and trawl fisheries outside of the Antarctic. So there are many, many different impacts going on which are impacting on these Antarctic predators. And in fact, penguins and albatrosses are the most threatened groups of seabirds globally. So a network of protected areas around the Antarctic is really critical for a whole number of reasons. First of all, obviously, if we have spatial protection measures, we protect sessile species, animals which can't move and which are fixed to the seabed. Also, we're able to protect critical foraging grounds and spawning grounds for Antarctic marine species. And finally, we also protect the overall functioning of Antarctic marine ecosystems. So to summarise that, I would just say that Antarctica has been exploited in the past. It is still remarkably intact and harbours a highly endemic fauna and spectacular populations of marine predators such as seabirds and seals and so on. I just put up one figure here. South Georgia, which of course is one of the main UK interests in the sub-Antarctic, harbours more than 100 million seabirds and 4 to 5 million fur seals. There are still pressures to exploit biotic resources in the Antarctic, particularly krill. It's probably the largest untapped fishery globally at present time. So this expansion of krill fishing using these new technologies is of particular concern, as it does have the capacity, certainly, to locally deplete krill populations and to compete with predators for those krill. And of course, there's also the potential for climate change-induced impacts on sub-ocean ecosystems and many other pressures on Antarctic biota, which mean that protective measures are required, certainly inside Antarctic waters, but also outside. And we've got to bear in mind this network of protected areas that's being proposed around the Antarctic should form part of a much wider network of protected areas globally.
So now I'd like to take you through some of the work of the Antarctic Ocean Alliance and also some of the key elements of our report. Well, as you've heard today, Antarctica is a bit of an ecological wonderland. It's a place with a complex and fragile food web, where every single living thing relies on the oceans for their survival. It's a place with the most pristine ocean environments left on the planet, so it's a place which is particularly precious and worth protecting. As we've also heard, Antarctica faces multiple threats to their health, including overfishing, global warming, ocean acidification, pollution, habitat loss, and invasive species are also a concern, just to name a few. One of the good things is that some of these issues and problems are actually eminently solvable and within our own lifetimes through the creation of marine reserves and protected areas. And so that's why this solution is so critical. The Antarctic Ocean Alliance is a collaboration of over 20 now, environment and conservation groups from around the world, campaigning to establish a network of marine reserves and marine protected areas, an order of magnitude greater than anything that has actually been achieved anywhere else on the planet. It's a great vision. Some of these organisations will be familiar to you and some of them will not. But today we have alliance partners working in the UK, Germany, Belgium, Norway, the United States, France, Australia, New Zealand, China and Korea. And we're hoping to attract more partners from other places that are critical to the CCAMLR decisions that are coming up in the coming months. These groups collectively represent the interests of millions of people around the world and millions of people who are deeply concerned about the state of the environment. And also, these groups are becoming more and more alive to the potential of what is actually possible in terms of ocean conservation in Antarctica. The current reality is that around 1%, Lord Deepen says 1.8%, of the world's oceans are fully protected against commercial extractive activities, and yet international agreements currently suggest, and many of them suggest, that this number should be far, far higher than it is. CCAMLR is one of the fora where we can actually get really good outcomes at the moment, and that's why there's quite a lot of attention coming towards it. 7 years ago, the CCAMLR nations took up the challenge given them by the World Summit on Sustainable Development and actually pledged to create a network of marine protected areas around Antarctica, and they pledged to do this by 2012. And the big question is, how far will they go and how much can we actually achieve? So the Antarctic Ocean Alliance has identified 19 areas around Antarctica for consideration. And this is the great vision. Despite the 2012 deadline or milestone, I guess, that CCAMLR has adopted, it's not going to be possible to achieve all of this year. It's just far too much work for that body to actually be able to churn through the work. In fact, it will probably take a few years to get all of it done. But we do believe that it is possible this year to obtain a very large part of this network, and that's extremely exciting. In our new report, the Alliance's research has identified around 40% of the Southern Ocean that warrants protection based on scientific evidence, combining existing protected areas, areas which have been analysed for their potential as protected areas by various countries, which I'll mention later, and also including additional key habitats that we've been looking at through the scientific research and analysis that the Alliance has been doing. Now, the United Kingdom has already demonstrated great leadership in this arena by proposing the world's first MPA located entirely in the high seas in the South Orkney Islands. And this was adopted by CCAMLR in 2009, so it's actually the first step towards this network. It was a great achievement, and some thought that it couldn't be done. And I think it's a good example of looking at something where people could be pessimistic about it and then saying, well, actually, we can do this. And looking at this network, which is quite visionary, I think it's possible to go, this is really hard, but I think we can do this. We have to work together and we have to do some pretty serious heavy lifting around the world to make it happen. Today there are also several different Antarctic conservation proposals on the table, and two well-developed scenarios are currently emerging for the Ross Sea and East Antarctica, so I'll talk quite a lot about those areas today. The governments who've been involved in that development are New Zealand, the US, Australia and France, and all of them do deserve fair credit here for their leadership and how far we've got so far. But over the next few months, the CCAMLR partners will decide the future of these places, and the Alliance agrees that these decisions must be based on science, of course, but we argue that protection and the precautionary principle should be primary considerations in the designation of these areas. So let me take you first to the first map I'd like to show you, which is the work that we're doing on East Antarctica. And this will actually be the subject of a fuller report later in the year. We've done two now. We've done one on the Ross Sea, which is available, and also the 19 areas report that we're launching today. For East Antarctica, we looked at the current scenario, which has been proposed by Australia and France, as well as a raft of additional studies, and concluded that the areas proposed, which are the ones in the green boxes, can be enhanced and expanded. The Australian scenario has identified 6 areas for various levels of protection. I think there's 3 marine reserves and 3 marine protected areas that they're talking about. And these areas contain an array of unique features, including continental shelf pelagic ecosystems, a continental ridge, a biodiversity hotspot for molluscs, seamounts, canyons, and a probable nursery ground for young krill. But the AOA proposes, firstly, putting all these areas into marine reserves, so upping the level of protection. And secondly, taking this protection further. We have identified a number of additional areas, which are the areas in the ovals, that we believe should be considered for inclusion in the network. And these include the cosmonaut and additional polynyas, which are areas of open sea when the sea ice actually freezes up. An extension to the Prids Bay area to include a unique trough mouth fan, which is in the sort of 2 ovals down. We are looking at the eastern D'Urville seamounts and a larger foraging range for Adelie and emperor penguins and also for crab-eater, leopard and elephant seals. East Antarctica, as I've said, will be the subject of a forthcoming report, and we're hoping to get that done by around August. And also, we'd dearly like to launch that in China, potentially, if we can get the work done in time. The next area I'd like to take you through is the Ross Sea. This year, we believe the CCAMLR partners have the opportunity to establish a marine reserve and probably the largest and most significant marine reserve on the planet in the waters of the Ross Sea. This region is the most intact marine environment on Earth, and it has been subject to much scrutiny. It's the subject of our first report, which is available here if you'd like to pick it up. This map here is in our new report, but this analysis here was in our first report. And we looked at the 2 scenarios developed by New Zealand and the United States. And we concluded that these 2 scenarios, which are already on the table and certainly demonstrate leadership and a willingness to move towards establishing marine protection in this area, but we believe that they don't go far enough for a number of reasons. They don't meet the highest standards of marine conservation that we'd like to see. So our proposal includes adding 3 additional areas to any marine reserve which is established. Additional area 1, which is in the screen on the bottom, your bottom left, contains the only ocean trough that is located within this entire region, and a mid-ocean ridge rift valley that intersects that trough. That intersects the Antarctic Circumpolar current. And these conditions create an area which is extremely highly productive and has quite a rich ecosystem. Additional area 2, which is in the middle, protects the richest and most biodiverse zone in the Ross Sea slope and shelf. This area includes 2 ridges that join major canyons that are key components of the regional ecosystems, and they transfer nutrients between the slope and shelf and the abyss. And they also provide migration routes for Antarctic toothfish and other creatures. Area 2 is also identified as a key feeding ground for the Antarctic toothfish. And this is a really important point because the Antarctic toothfish, as Professor Rogers has said, is a very long-lived species. Its life cycle is not understood fully by science. We don't know where the breeding grounds are. We have never seen juveniles and eggs, etc. And there's already in CCAMLR, they've pledged to protect areas which have full life cycle significance for some of these species. And we think that on that basis, this part of the Ross Sea slope and shelf should be included. Area 2 also protects a couple of very important seamounts, the Scott Seamount and the Tangaroa Seamount, neither of which have been placed in the proposals or the scenarios by the US and New Zealand. Additional Area 3 protects some mid-oceanic ridges, which are likely to have many, many unique species. And the final thing to say about the Ross Sea is that it is also one of the areas which is actually reducing in temperature at the moment in terms of climate change. The climate change impacts around Antarctica are not linear. Some areas are warming and some areas are actually cooling. And the Ross Sea, we believe, can become a really major refuge for ice-dependent species should other areas around Antarctica actually become more and more unstable. So we think for that reason, it's also a very important candidate for large-scale protection. So if established and the CCAMLR accepts the AOA proposal, which we believe that they should, CCAMLR would be establishing the largest marine reserve on the planet and an area of about 3.6 million square kilometres, and we think that's a great vision, a grand vision for the member states to support. I'm just going to take you through a couple of the other maps in conclusion. Over the coming months and in alignment with the CCAMLR process itself, we'll be publishing a series of reports that will add detail to our vision, that will work alongside the workshops that are happening inside the CCAMLR process, that will aggregate new science if it can be found. Today's document itself contains some initial thinking for most parts of the Southern Ocean. We've got a very firm proposal for the Ross Sea, and we're starting to develop the detail for East Antarctica. But this is one of the additional parts of our 19 areas. This is Peter I Island, and there's some very important seamount features here, geos, which are sort of tabletop seamounts that are quite unique to this area. So we're adding them in and saying that these areas should also be protected. I think this will be one of those ones which takes a while to come up because there are no firm proposals or scenarios at this stage. This is another map from the report, which I'm sure you'll be reading cover to cover over the next couple of days. This is the Kerguelen area, and these are the sorts of areas that the Antarctic Ocean Alliance is very interested in developing more, and we believe they do require firm protection. So we also believe that the global public has a right to participate in the process, and we are giving them that opportunity through our campaign. This is our website, antarcticocean.org. I'm sure you'll all be signing up if you haven't already, and we'll be keeping people up to date with our campaign. Currently, we've got about 38,000 people on the ticker, and we're hoping that that will climb over the next 5 months or so. So the Alliance is calling on the UK government to maintain and enhance the momentum at CCAMLR this year, and to support our call for the world's largest network of marine reserves and marine protected areas in the oceans around Antarctica as a legacy for future generations. Now, we know that this may mean some hard choices, and we also know that this may mean some hard politics, but we're fully committed to helping the countries, nations that we believe can play a leadership role in this process, and the UK is one of them. The organisations involved in this campaign will be asking political decision makers around the world to embrace our vision as well. So it's not just we're talking to the likely allies, but we're also talking to some of the tough countries who we believe are going to be difficult in the process. And we'd like them to embrace our vision. We need our governments, we need our decision makers to deliver this vision, to be part of a grand legacy, to not be limited by the politics of business as usual, which are part of international decision-making processes usually. I'd like to thank, in conclusion, all of the team who wrote this report. None of them are here. We have quite a networked campaign team around the world, the Alliance, but a lot of people put an awful lot of hard work into producing this who aren't here. The only members of the actual Antarctic Ocean Alliance team here are myself and Donna, who's our European campaign coordinator. So if you haven't met Donna tonight, I'd be delighted if you could shake her hand, because she's the person carrying the can for the whole push here in Europe. I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. And we do have probably a few minutes for a Q&A, say 5 to 10 minutes, if people have got any specific questions for me or my fellow panellists.
Any thought to how these areas might actually be policed? Given that it's South Georgia, the only way we can really fund the policing is through a patrol vessel that's funded to some extent by the revenue generated through licence fees from the fishing industry.
Well, I mean, there are a number of things going on that certainly help in terms of policing. One is market-based measures, obviously making sure that fish that are flowing into markets are actually documented properly so we know where they're coming from. But this is actually a problem that we're facing globally, particularly with high seas marine protected areas, but also particularly in the waters of developing countries, for example. How do you police fisheries in those waters when those states can't actually afford to build fisheries protection vessels or maintain them and so on? I think this is something which technology has a major role in helping with, both through the mandatory placing of VMS, vessel monitoring systems on ships, actually improving those VMS systems so that not only do they record where a vessel is, but also what it's doing, and also in satellite monitoring of where vessels are going and what they're doing. And certainly it's quite possible with the technology we have on satellites now to more or less keep an eye on vessels and to actually reach some understanding of what they're doing. Because obviously if a vessel is going from A to B, it's going from A to B as quickly and efficiently as possible. If it stops and poodles around to drop a net in the water, a long line, whatever, that can quite easily be identified from satellite. So I think there's a major role in terms of technology here, market-based measures, and the other area that needs to be looked at is basically intelligence gathering on illegal fishing activities at an international level, perhaps with assistance from organisations such as Interpol.
So,
I just had to react to the idea that enforcement could only be paid for by fishing. It is, of course, it can be paid for by government if government choose to do that, and it is peanuts. And government wouldn't normally fund the police force from the taxing crime or any other means. So I just wanted to make the point, but more seriously to ask a question, and that is to know about the plans of AOA for South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands, which will probably be dealt with in this country, if I dare say that, rather than in CCAMLR.
And the answer is exactly the point you make, which is we are really focusing on the CCAMLR process. So it's not an area, you know, we're very encouraged that there is protection being talked about and certainly think that there should be increased protection in South Georgia, but we're engaging very much in the CCAMLR arena, and so that's where we'll be focusing our attention. We're very supportive of the efforts, but, you know, as you know, all groups and organisations have to make decisions around priorities, and so we're looking at some of those other areas where we think some heavy lifting has to be done.
To a certain extent, we're pushing at an open door in the UK, but can you tell us a little bit about the campaign in Russia, in Japan, Korea, some of the more difficult nations?
Sure. So we have a campaign team and a campaign plan established in South Korea, which is a key nation, particularly in terms of the Ross Sea opportunity this year. We're launching there on June the 7th. And we're doing a combined report of the Circumpolar report and the Ross Sea report in Korean with a special Korean section, which we'll be launching in a few weeks up there. And we're very much looking at engaging with government and engaging with the public, and our partner organisations in Korea are KFEM, which is a Korean Federated Environment Movement, the Citizens Institute for Environmental Studies, and also Greenpeace in Korea. So we're starting to fire up there. China, we're looking at a launch, as I say, in August, and we're working with two groups at the moment. One is Greenpeace in China, and the other is a new group called Greenovation Hub, which is a sort of a new group which is developing to look at both sort of environmental issues domestically in China, but they're also looking at international campaign issues, and they're actually going to be our partner organisation. We'll be delighted if WWF China come on board and help us out, and we have had some conversations with them, and they're looking at it. In Russia, we haven't quite got there yet. to be honest with you, and it's one thing that I'm very keen to be looking at from a strategic perspective, to be setting up there and to be doing some work. One sage has said that this campaign is the fastest campaign startup in history, and I think we got going in August last year. So we're very pleased to be where we are today. But there's just some countries we haven't quite been able to chip off yet. But Russia's definitely very high on our radar. It's one of our key countries. We know that strategically, and we're starting to think about how we will engage there. Japan, ASOC is doing some work there, and they're looking at developing a campaign plan. I know they're working there with WWF and also with ourselves in Japan. So we've got elements building. We launched in New Zealand in February, in Australia essentially at CCAMLR last year, and we're launching here in Europe now. So we're sort of on the trail. Well, if there's no more questions, last call. Going once, twice, 3 times. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's been a great pleasure having you all here and to be able to present the work. And there's still some drinks available, so please stick around and introduce yourselves and mingle. And thank you very much. Thank you very much to our speakers this evening, Alice.